Sarah Martinez had always been the smallest person in every room she entered. At 5 feet 2 inches and barely 110 pounds, she looked more like someone who belonged in a library than on a military training ground. But there she was, standing in formation with 49 other recruits at the Naval Special Warfare Basic Training Facility in San Diego, California. The morning sun was already brutal at 6 a.m., and sweat dripped down her face as she tried to keep her breathing steady. Around her, massive men who looked like they were carved from granite stood at attention. Their shoulders were twice as wide as hers, their arms thick with muscle that had been built over years of preparation for this moment. Sarah had prepared too, but looking around, she wondered if her preparation had been enough. She had grown up in a small town in Texas, where her father worked as a mechanic and her mother taught elementary school. Neither of them had military backgrounds, but Sarah had always been drawn to stories of heroism and service. When she was 12, she read about the first women being allowed into combat roles, and something clicked inside her mind. She wanted to be part of something bigger than herself. The decision to join the Navy came after college, where she studied physical therapy and worked part-time at a gym. She had always been athletic, playing soccer and running track in high school, but she knew that what lay ahead would test her in ways she had never experienced. The recruiter had been honest with her about the challenges, especially for someone of her size trying to make it through the most demanding military training in the world. During her first week at basic training, Sarah quickly realized that physical strength was only part of the equation. The instructors were testing their mental toughness, their ability to work as a team, and their determination to push through when everything in their body told them to quit. She excelled in the classroom portions, scoring in the top 5% on written tests about tactics, navigation, and military history, but when it came to the physical challenges, Sarah struggled. The obstacle courses seemed designed for people twice her size. The rope climbs left her hands bloody and raw. The long-distance swims in cold ocean water made her muscles cramp and her teeth chatter uncontrollably. Each night, she collapsed into her bunk feeling like she had been hit by a truck. The worst part was not the physical pain, but the look she got from some of the other recruits. A few of them had started whispering when they thought she could not hear them. They questioned whether someone her size belonged there, whether she was taking up a spot that could go to someone more capable. Sarah tried to ignore the comments, but they stung more than she wanted to admit. Her bunkmate Jessica was one of only 6 women in the program. Jessica was nearly 6 feet tall and had been a college basketball player before joining the military. She tried to encourage Sarah, but even Jessica seemed concerned about whether Sarah would make it through the program. The first major test came during the 3rd week. It was called the Hell Week simulation, though it was only a taste of what real Hell Week would bring. The recruits had to complete a series of challenges with minimal sleep and food. They carried heavy logs as a team, crawled through muddy obstacle courses, and ran mile after mile along the beach while instructors shouted at their megaphones. Sarah gave everything she had, but her body kept failing her. During the log carries, she was too short to get a good grip, forcing her teammates to compensate for her lack of leverage. During the beach runs, her shorter legs meant she had to work twice as hard to keep up with the pack. By the end of the simulation, she was dead last in almost every individual drill. The instructors gathered all the recruits after the simulation ended. Chief Petty Officer Williams, a 20-year veteran with scars on his arms and a permanent scowl, walked slowly down the line of exhausted recruits. When he reached Sarah, he stopped and looked down at her with an expression that was hard to read. Sarah expected him to tell her that she was not cut out for this, that she should consider a different path in the Navy. Instead, he simply noted her performance on his clipboard and moved on. But she could feel the weight of his assessment, and she knew that her time in the program was running short. That night, as she lay in her bunk with ice packs on her knees and bandages on her hands, Sarah seriously considered quitting for the first time. The physical demands were only going to get harder, and she was already falling behind. She thought about her parents, who had been so proud when she told them about her goals. She thought about all the people who had doubted whether women belonged in combat roles, but she also thought about why she had come here in the first place. It was not about proving anything to other people. It was about testing her own limits and serving her country in the most meaningful way she could. As she drifted off to sleep, Sarah made a decision. She would continue to give everything she had, regardless of what others thought or what the odds looked like. The next morning brought new challenges, and Sarah was determined to face them head-on. She had no idea that in a few days, everything would change when a SEAL commander noticed something in her that no one else had seen. For now, all she could do was focus on the next drill, the next test, and the next opportunity to prove that heart and determination could overcome physical limitations. The training was far from over, and the hardest tests still lay ahead. But Sarah Martinez was still standing, still fighting, and still refusing to give up on her dream of becoming something more than anyone thought possible. The fourth week of training brought the combat drills, and Sarah's struggles became impossible to hide. The hand-to-hand combat sessions were particularly brutal for someone of her size. During the first drill, she was paired with Martinez, a former college wrestler who outweighed her by 90 pounds. Within seconds, she found herself on the ground, gasping for air while the instructor shook his head in disappointment. Combat training was different from the endurance challenges. Here, technique mattered more than raw strength, but Sarah had never learned to fight. Growing up, she had avoided conflicts and focused on her studies. Now, she was expected to master moves that required muscle memory and instinctive responses that she simply did not possess. The close-quarters combat instructor, Sergeant Rodriguez, was a compact man with lightning-fast reflexes and zero patience for weakness. He demonstrated each technique once, then expected the recruits to execute it perfectly. When Sarah struggled to perform a basic takedown maneuver, Rodriguez stopped the entire class to use her as an example of what not to do. Standing in the center of the mat with 49 pairs of eyes watching her, Sarah felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. Rodriguez had her repeat the move over and over while he pointed out every mistake. Her stance was wrong, her timing was off, and her follow-through lacked power. Each correction felt like another nail in the coffin of her military dreams. The firearms training was equally challenging. Sarah had grown up in Texas, but her family had never owned guns. While other recruits handled the weapons with familiarity, Sarah struggled with basic concepts like sight alignment and trigger control. The recoil from the rifles left her shoulder aching, and her accuracy scores were consistently among the lowest in the group. During one particularly difficult shooting exercise, Sarah missed the target completely on her first 3 attempts. The range instructor, a grizzled veteran named Gunny Peterson, walked over to her station and watched as she missed again. He did not say anything, but his disappointed sigh spoke volumes. Around her, other recruits were hitting bullseyes. While she could barely keep her shots on paper, the tactical movement drills were another source of frustration. These exercises required teams to move through simulated combat environments while maintaining coordination and communication. Sarah's shorter legs made it difficult for her to keep pace with her team's movements, and her lack of experience showed in every decision she made under pressure. During one drill, her team was tasked with clearing a mock building while under simulated enemy fire. Sarah was assigned to cover the rear, but she became disoriented in the maze-like structure and lost track of her teammates. When the exercise ended, she found herself alone in a room. Having completely failed to maintain her assigned position, the team debriefing was painful. Her teammates were not openly critical, but their frustration was obvious. In high-stakes situations, everyone needed to trust that their partners would perform their roles correctly. Sarah's mistakes put the entire team at risk. Even in training scenarios, Chief Petty Officer Williams began pulling Sarah aside for individual discussions after each failed drill. These conversations were brief and to the point. Williams would review her performance, identify specific areas where she had fallen short, and give her additional tasks to work on during her limited free time. Sarah appreciated that Williams was trying to help rather than simply washing her out of the program. But the extra attention also made her feel like a charity case. She could see other recruits watching these private sessions, And she knew they were wondering why the instructors were wasting time on someone who was clearly not going to make it. The psychological pressure was becoming as challenging as the physical demands. Sarah began second-guessing every decision during drills, which only made her performance worse. She would hesitate before executing moves, worried about making mistakes, and that hesitation often led to exactly the kind of errors she was trying to avoid. Sleep became elusive as Sarah replayed each day's failures in her mind. She would lie awake analyzing what had gone wrong and trying to figure out how to improve. But the more she focused on her mistakes, the more they seemed to multiply. It was a vicious cycle that was affecting every aspect of her performance. Jessica, her bunkmate, tried to offer encouragement, but even she was starting to look worried. One evening, Jessica sat on the edge of Sarah's bunk and spoke quietly so the other recruits could not hear. Jessica explained that she had been through challenges in her own military training, but nothing like what Sarah was facing. She suggested that Sarah might want to consider whether this particular path was right for her. There were other ways to serve in the Navy that would better match her skills and abilities. The suggestion hit Sarah like a physical blow. Even her closest friend in the program was starting to doubt whether she belonged there. Sarah appreciated Jessica's concern, but hearing those words out loud made her realize how close she was to giving up entirely. That weekend, Sarah had her first opportunity to call home since training began. She spoke to her parents from a payphone outside the base, and their voices brought tears to her eyes. They asked how training was going, and Sarah found herself lying, telling them everything was fine and that she was learning a lot. She could not bring herself to tell them about the daily failures, the embarrassing moments in front of the entire class, or the growing certainty that she was not going to make it through the program. Her parents were so proud of her for even attempting something this challenging, and she did not want to disappoint them. After hanging up the phone, Sarah walked alone along the beach near the base. The ocean waves crashed against the shore in a steady rhythm, and she tried to find some peace in the sound. She thought about quitting and going home, about finding a different way to serve her country that would not require her to excel in areas where she was clearly outmatched, but something inside her refused to accept defeat. Maybe she was not the biggest or the strongest, and maybe she lacked the natural instincts for combat that seemed to come easily to others. But she was still here, still standing, still willing to try again tomorrow. As she walked back toward the barracks, Sarah made a silent promise to herself. She would continue to give everything she had until they officially told her to leave. She owed that much to herself and to everyone who believed in her, even if that belief was starting to feel misplaced. The fifth week brought the arrival of Commander James Mitchell, a decorated SEAL officer who had come to observe the training program and evaluate the current class of recruits. Mitchell was a legend among the special operations community. With over 15 years of combat experience and a reputation for being able to spot potential in places others missed, Sarah had heard stories about Mitchell from some of the instructors. He had led successful missions in some of the world's most dangerous locations and had a gift for developing unconventional tactics that saved lives. More importantly for the recruits, he had influence over who would be allowed to continue in the program and who would be reassigned to other roles in the Navy. Mitchell spent his first day observing classes and drills without speaking to any of the recruits directly. He carried himself with the quiet confidence that came from years of leading men and women in life-or-death situations. Sarah noticed that he paid attention to everything, from how recruits handled weapons to how they interacted with their teammates. During breaks, during the morning combat drill on Mitchell's second day, Sarah found herself once again struggling with a grappling exercise. She was paired with Thompson, another large recruit who had been patient with her inexperience but was clearly frustrated by her continued difficulties. As they practiced defensive moves, Sarah repeatedly failed to execute the techniques that Rodriguez had demonstrated. Rodriguez stopped the drill and called Sarah to the center of the mat again. This time, with Commander Mitchell watching from the sidelines, the humiliation felt even more intense. Rodriguez had Sarah attempt a basic escape maneuver while he explained to the class why her approach was fundamentally flawed. Sarah's timing was off. Her body position was wrong, and she lacked the explosive power needed to break free from a larger opponent's grip. Rodriguez demonstrated the correct technique using Sarah as his training partner, easily controlling her movements while explaining the physics behind effective combat techniques. As the demonstration continued, Sarah caught sight of Mitchell's face. He was watching intently, but his expression was unreadable. She expected to see the same disappointment she had grown used to seeing from other instructors. But Mitchell's face revealed nothing about what he was thinking. The tactical shooting drill that afternoon was equally disastrous. Sarah's team was tasked with engaging multiple targets while advancing through a course that simulated urban combat. Her shooting accuracy had improved slightly over the past weeks, but under the pressure of movement and time constraints, she reverted to her earlier struggles. During the exercise, Sarah fell behind her team's advance and found herself out of position when they encountered a cluster of targets. Her shots went wide, and she failed to provide the covering fire her teammates needed. The exercise ended with Sarah's team receiving a failing score. Primarily due to her poor performance, Gunny Peterson gathered Sarah's team for the post-exercise debrief, and his criticism was sharper than usual. With Mitchell observing, Peterson did not hold back in detailing how Sarah's failures had compromised the entire team's effectiveness. He spoke about the importance of every team member being able to perform their role under pressure, and how a single weak link could get people killed in real combat situations. Sarah stood at attention while Peterson listed her mistakes, her face burning with shame. She could feel Mitchell's eyes on her, and she knew that this was likely the moment when her fate in the program would be sealed. She had given everything she had, but everything she had was not enough. That evening, word spread through the barracks that Mitchell would be conducting individual interviews with selected recruits. Sarah's name was not on the initial list, which she took as confirmation that her time in the program was ending. She spent the evening cleaning her gear and preparing for what she assumed would be her dismissal from the program. The next morning brought another round of combat drills, and Sarah's performance showed no improvement. During hand-to-hand combat practice, she was thrown to the ground repeatedly by different sparring partners. Each fall seemed to highlight her physical limitations and her lack of natural fighting instincts. Rodriguez paired her with Williams, one of the most technically skilled recruits in the class, for a demonstration of advanced grappling techniques. Williams was not trying to hurt her, but the size and strength difference made the outcome inevitable. Within moments, Sarah found herself trapped in a submission hold, tapping out while the rest of the class watched. She got back to her feet. Sarah noticed that Mitchell had moved closer to observe the drill. He was standing just a few feet away, his arms crossed, watching her with the same unreadable expression. When their eyes met briefly, Sarah expected to see judgment or dismissal, but instead she saw something that looked almost like curiosity. The morning's final drill was an obstacle course that combined physical challenges with tactical decision-making. Recruits had to navigate through a series of barriers while carrying full combat gear, making split-second choices about routes and timing. Sarah had completed this course several times before, always finishing among the last few recruits. This time, as Sarah struggled through the rope climb portion of the course, she lost her grip and fell several feet to the ground below. The fall knocked the wind out of her, and she lay on the sand for several seconds trying to catch her breath. When she finally got to her feet, she realized that most of the other recruits had already finished the course. Mitchell approached the area where Sarah was dusting herself off and checking her equipment. For a moment she thought he was going to speak to her, but instead he simply observed as she prepared to complete the remaining obstacles. His presence was intimidating, but something about his quiet attention also felt different from the judgment she had grown accustomed to. Sarah completed the course, finishing dead last as usual, but she noticed that Mitchell continued to watch her even after she crossed the finish line. When the drill ended and the recruits were dismissed for lunch, Mitchell remained on the training ground, speaking quietly with Rodriguez and Williams about something she could not hear. During lunch, Jessica mentioned that several recruits had been called for individual meetings with Mitchell. The interviews were apparently focused on leadership potential and mental toughness rather than just physical performance. Jessica wondered aloud whether Sarah might still have a chance if Mitchell was looking for qualities beyond raw combat skills. Sarah appreciated Jessica's optimism, but she had resigned herself to the reality of her situation. She had given her best effort and come up short in every meaningful metric. The honorable thing now was to accept that outcome gracefully and find another way to serve her country. As the afternoon training session began, Sarah noticed that Mitchell was no longer observing from the sidelines. He had apparently finished his evaluation and moved on to other duties. She felt a strange mix of relief and disappointment, knowing that her fate had likely been decided, but not yet knowing what that decision would be. The training continued. And Sarah continued to struggle, but something had shifted in her mindset. Whether it was the certainty that her time was ending or some other factor, she found herself approaching each drill with less anxiety about the outcome. She was still failing, but the failures no longer felt quite as devastating as they had before. The call came during evening chow time on Wednesday. Chief Petty Officer Williams approached Sarah's table and quietly informed her that Commander Mitchell wanted to see her in his temporary office immediately. Sarah's stomach dropped as she set down her fork. Knowing this was likely the conversation where she would be told her time in the program was over. Jessica heard an encouraging nod as Sarah stood up, but they both knew what this meeting probably meant. Sarah had been expecting this moment for weeks, and now that it had arrived, she felt strangely calm. She had given everything she had, and that would have to be enough. Regardless of the outcome, Mitchell's temporary office was located in a small building adjacent to the main training complex. Sarah knocked on the door and waited for permission to enter. When Mitchell called her in, she found him sitting behind a metal desk, reviewing a thick folder that she assumed contained her training records and performance evaluations. Mitchell gestured for her to take a seat across from his desk. For several moments, he continued reading through her file without speaking. Sarah sat at attention, her hands folded in her lap, trying to prepare herself mentally for whatever was about to happen. When Mitchell finally looked up, his expression was serious but not unkind. He studied Sarah's face for a moment before speaking, and when he did, his voice was quieter than she had expected. Mitchell began by acknowledging what they both knew. Sarah's performance in combat drills had been consistently below the standards expected of special operations candidates. Her physical limitations were real, and her lack of experience in combat situations had made every drill a struggle. Any objective assessment would conclude that she was not ready for the demands of SEAL training. Sarah nodded, accepting this evaluation without argument. She had known from the beginning that her size and inexperience would be challenges, but she had hoped that determination and effort might be enough to overcome them. The evidence of the past 5 weeks had proven otherwise, but then Mitchell surprised her. He set down her file and leaned back in his chair, studying her with those same unreadable eyes she had noticed during the training exercises. He asked her a question that caught her completely off guard. Why had she never given up? Sarah was not sure how to answer. She explained that quitting had never felt like an option, even when she was clearly failing. She talked about her commitment to serving her country and her belief that she owed it to herself to give her absolute best effort. Regardless of the outcome, Mitchell listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding as Sarah spoke. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment before asking another unexpected question. He wanted to know what she had learned about herself during the past 5 weeks. Beyond just the military skills they had been teaching, this question required more thought. Sarah reflected on how the training had pushed her beyond any limits she had previously known. She had discovered reserves of mental strength she had not known existed, and she had learned to function effectively even when her body was screaming at her to stop. Most importantly, she had learned the difference between failing at something and being a failure as a person. Mitchell seemed genuinely interested in her responses, and Sarah began to understand that this was not the dismissal conversation she had been expecting. Instead, it felt more like an evaluation of qualities that were not captured in standard performance metrics. The conversation continued for nearly an hour, covering everything from Sarah's childhood experiences to her long-term goals in the military. Mitchell asked about her leadership experience, her ability to work under pressure, and her understanding of what it meant to be part of a team where every member's life depended on the others. As they talked, Sarah began to realize that Mitchell was evaluating her through a completely different lens than the other instructors had used. While they had focused on her physical performance and technical skills, he seemed more interested in her character, her mental resilience, and her potential for growth. Near the end of their conversation, Mitchell revealed something that surprised Sarah even more. He explained that he had been watching her not just during the obvious failures, but also during the moments between drills. He had noticed how she helped other recruits with their gear, how she never complained about her assignments, and how she approached each new challenge with the same level of effort regardless of her previous failures. Mitchell told her about a concept that was not taught in the standard curriculum: the difference between warriors who were born with natural advantages and warriors who were forged through adversity. He explained that some of the most effective special operations personnel he had worked with had not been the biggest or strongest members of their teams, but rather the ones who had learned to overcome significant obstacles through sheer determination. This conversation was unlike anything Sarah had expected, and she found herself seeing her training experience from a completely different perspective. Instead of focusing only on her failures, Mitchell was helping her understand that her persistence in the face of those failures might actually be a valuable quality in the right context. As the meeting drew to a close, Mitchell stood up and walked around his desk to face Sarah directly. He explained that he was not going to make any immediate decisions about her future in the program, but he wanted her to understand something important about the nature of special operations work. The most critical moments in combat, Mitchell told her, were not always the ones that required overwhelming physical force or perfect technical execution. Sometimes the most important quality was simply the refusal to give up when everything seemed hopeless. That kind of mental toughness could not be taught in a classroom or measured in a combat drill. Mitchell then gave Sarah an assignment that was unlike anything she had received before. He wanted her to spend the next few days observing her fellow recruits during training exercises, but instead of focusing on their physical performance, he wanted her to pay attention to how they handled failure, how they supported their teammates, and how they responded to unexpected challenges. As Sarah prepared to leave the office, Mitchell made one final comment that would stick with her for the rest of her time in the program. He told her that warriors were not defined by their ability to avoid failure, but by their response to failure when it inevitably occurred, walking back toward the barracks. Sarah felt confused but also strangely hopeful. The conversation had not gone at all as she had expected, and she was not sure what Mitchell's interest in her meant for her future in the program. But for the first time in weeks, she felt like someone in authority had seen something in her beyond just her obvious limitations. That night, as Sarah lay in her bunk replaying the conversation with Mitchell, she realized that her entire approach to training had been focused on trying not to fail rather than on learning from failure. Mitchell seemed to be suggesting that there was value in her struggles that she had not recognized. The next morning would bring new challenges and likely new failures, but Sarah approached them with a different mindset. Instead of dreading the combat drills, she found herself curious about what she might learn from them beyond just the technical skills they were designed to teach. The next few days of training took on a completely different character for Sarah. Following Mitchell's instructions, she began observing her fellow recruits with new eyes, paying attention to details she had previously missed while focusing only on her own performance struggles. During Thursday morning's combat drill, Sarah watched as Johnson, one of the strongest recruits in the class, became visibly frustrated when Rodriguez introduced a new grappling technique that he could not master immediately. Johnson's usual confidence cracked, and his subsequent attempts became increasingly sloppy as his anger grew. Sarah noticed how his inability to handle this single setback affected his performance for the rest of the morning. In contrast, she observed Martinez, who had always been technically proficient, struggle with a tactical shooting exercise that required split-second decision-making under pressure. Instead of getting frustrated, Martinez calmly asked Rodriguez for specific feedback and then methodically practiced the problematic sequence until he improved. Sarah began to understand what Mitchell meant about different responses to failure. The most revealing observation came during Friday's team exercise. The recruits were divided into squads and tasked with completing a complex mission that required coordination between multiple elements. Sarah's squad included Thompson, Williams, and Jackson, all of whom had consistently outperformed her in individual drills. During the exercise, their squad encountered an unexpected obstacle when their planned route was blocked by simulated enemy positions. Instead of adapting to the new situation, Thompson insisted on sticking to the original plan, arguing that they should push through despite the changed circumstances. Williams supported Thompson's position, while Jackson seemed uncertain about the best course of action. Sarah found herself in an unusual position. For the first time in weeks, she was not focused on her own performance limitations, but instead was analyzing the tactical situation from a broader perspective. She could see an alternative route that would avoid the obstacle while still achieving their objective, but suggesting it would require her to speak up against the opinions of 3 recruits who had consistently outperformed her. After a moment of hesitation, Sarah quietly presented her alternative approach to the team. She explained how they could use a flanking maneuver that would take advantage of terrain features the enemy positions could not cover. Her suggestion was met with skepticism from Thompson, who questioned whether someone who had failed so many drills should be offering tactical advice, but Williams, who had been observing Sarah's analysis, recognized the merit in her approach. He supported her plan, and Jackson agreed to try it. Reluctantly, Thompson went along with the team decision. The alternative route Sarah had identified allowed them to complete their mission successfully while avoiding the casualties that a direct assault would have caused. After the exercise, Rodriguez gathered all the squads for a debrief session. When he reviewed Sarah's squad's performance, he specifically mentioned their ability to adapt when their original plan became unworkable. He used their mission as an example of how flexibility and creative thinking could be more valuable than raw physical capability in complex situations. Sarah noticed that Mitchell had been observing the team exercises from a distance, and she wondered if he had witnessed her contribution to her squad's success. For the first time since training began, she felt like she had added value to her team, rather than being a liability they had to compensate for. The weekend brought individual reflection time, and Sarah used the opportunity to think about Mitchell's assignment and what she had learned from observing her fellow recruits. She realized that many of them, despite their obvious physical advantages, had their own areas of weakness that became apparent under different types of stress. Johnson's inability to handle frustration, Thompson's inflexibility when plans changed, and even Williams's tendency to overthink complex situations were all limitations that could be just as problematic as Sarah's size disadvantage in the right circumstances. The key difference was that Sarah's limitations were immediately obvious, while theirs only became apparent in specific situations. Monday brought a new type of challenge that would test the recruits in ways none of them had experienced before. Rodriguez announced that they would be participating in a multi-day survival exercise that would combine physical endurance with problem-solving and teamwork. The exercise would be conducted with minimal food and equipment, simulating conditions they might face if separated from their unit during combat operations. The recruits were divided into teams of 5, and Sarah found herself grouped with Martinez, Chun, Foster, and Roberts. This team composition was interesting because none of these recruits had been among the top physical performers, but all of them had shown strong analytical and teamwork skills during previous exercises. The survival exercise began, with each team being dropped at different locations several miles from the base with only basic equipment and instructions to reach a designated extraction point within 3 days. They were allowed to carry minimal food and water, forcing them to find additional resources along the way. Sarah's team quickly discovered that this challenge played to different strengths than the combat drills had emphasized. Martinez's experience with wilderness camping proved invaluable for finding water sources. Chen's engineering background helped them construct effective shelter. Foster's calm demeanor kept the team focused during stressful moments. Sarah surprised herself by contributing in ways she had not expected. Her smaller size, which had been such a disadvantage in combat situations, actually proved useful when the team needed someone to access tight spaces or move quietly through dense vegetation. Her experience with long-distance running helped her maintain steady pace during extended movement. More importantly, Sarah found that her experience with failure had prepared her mentally for the frustrations and setbacks that the survival exercise presented. While other team members became discouraged when their first attempts at tasks failed, Sarah approached each problem with the persistence she had developed during weeks of combat drill failures. On the second day of the exercise, Sarah's team encountered a significant challenge when Chun injured his ankle while crossing a rocky stream. The injury was not serious enough to require evacuation, but it would slow their movement significantly and put them at risk of missing their extraction deadline. The team gathered to discuss their options, and Sarah found herself naturally taking a leadership role in the conversation. She suggested a modified route that would be easier for Chun to navigate, while still allowing them to reach their objective on time. When Martinez expressed concern about whether the alternative route would provide adequate water sources, Sarah volunteered to scout ahead to verify their options. Her reconnaissance mission was successful, and the team was able to adjust their plan based on her findings. They reached the extraction point on schedule, with Chun's injury managed effectively throughout the journey. During the post-exercise debrief, their team was recognized for their effective adaptation to unexpected circumstances. As the survival exercise concluded, Sarah reflected on how different this experience had been from the combat drills that had defined her first 5 weeks of training. Instead of feeling like a burden to her team, she had been a contributing member who added value in multiple ways. The exercise had played to her strengths rather than highlighting her weaknesses that evening. As she cleaned her gear and prepared for the next phase of training, Sarah realized that something fundamental had shifted in her understanding of what it meant to be a warrior. The survival exercise had shown her that effectiveness in special operations required a much broader range of skills than she had initially understood. Tuesday morning brought an unexpected announcement that would change everything for Sarah and her fellow recruits. Chief Petty Officer Williams gathered the entire class in the main training hall and informed them that Commander Mitchell would be conducting a special evaluation exercise that would influence final selection decisions for the program. Unlike previous drills that focused on specific skills, this exercise would be a comprehensive scenario designed to test leadership, decision-making, and performance under extreme stress. Each recruit would have the opportunity to lead a team through a complex mission that combined elements from all their previous training. Sarah felt her stomach tighten as Williams explained the details. This would be her chance to prove that she belonged in the program, but it would also be under the most pressure she had yet experienced. The scenario would involve a hostage rescue simulation with multiple variables and decision points that could change rapidly based on the team leader's choices. When Mitchell entered the room, the atmosphere became even more intense. He explained that each recruit would lead a 4-person team through the scenario, while he and the other instructors observed every aspect of their performance. The exercise would test not only tactical skills, but also the ability to maintain team cohesion under pressure and adapt to unexpected developments. The scenarios would run throughout the day, with each recruit getting approximately 1 hour to plan and execute their mission. Sarah was assigned the afternoon slot, which gave her time to observe several other recruits as they took their turns leading teams through the exercise. She watched as Johnson approached the scenario with his usual confidence, developing a straightforward plan that relied heavily on speed and overwhelming force. His team executed the plan effectively, but when unexpected complications arose, Johnson struggled to adapt quickly enough. His inability to handle the deviation from his original plan led to a simulated casualty that could have been avoided with more flexible thinking. Thompson's approach was more methodical, with detailed planning for multiple contingencies. His team moved through the scenario efficiently, but Thompson became so focused on following his predetermined procedures that he missed opportunities to exploit weaknesses in the simulated enemy positions. His rigid adherence to the plan prevented his team from achieving optimal results. Williams demonstrated excellent tactical knowledge and strong decision-making throughout his scenario. His team performed nearly flawlessly, completing their objectives with minimal risk exposure. Sarah recognized that Williams was setting the standard that all subsequent recruits would be measured against. As Sarah's turn approached, she felt the familiar nervousness that had accompanied every major challenge during her training. But this time, the nervousness was mixed with something different. Instead of focusing on her likely failure, she found herself genuinely curious about how she would handle the leadership responsibility when Mitchell called her name. Sarah stepped forward to receive her mission briefing. The scenario involved rescuing 2 hostages from a building occupied by hostile forces, with limited intelligence about enemy positions and capabilities. She would have 30 minutes to plan her approach and brief her team before execution began. Sarah's team consisted of Martinez, Foster, Chun, and Roberts, all recruits who had worked well with her during the survival exercise. As she reviewed the available intelligence and studied the building layout, Sarah realized that this scenario played to many of the same strengths that had served her well during the survival exercise. Instead of developing an elaborate plan that relied on perfect execution, Sarah focused on creating a flexible framework that could adapt to changing conditions. She identified multiple entry points and escape routes, assigned roles that played to each team member's strengths, and established clear communication protocols for coordinating their movements during the planning phase. Sarah did something that none of the previous team leaders had done. She asked each team member for their input on the plan and incorporated their suggestions where appropriate. Martinez identified a potential weakness in the building's security that could provide an advantage. Foster suggested modifications to the communication plan that would improve coordination. Sarah listened carefully to each suggestion and modified her approach accordingly. When the exercise began, Sarah's team moved into position with careful coordination. As they approached the building, they encountered the first unexpected development: additional enemy forces that had not been identified in the initial intelligence briefing. Instead of abandoning her plan, Sarah quickly assessed the new threat and adjusted her team's approach. She signaled for her team to hold position while she evaluated their options. Drawing on her experience from the survival exercise, Sarah identified an alternative entry point that would avoid the new enemy positions, while still providing access to the hostages. Her ability to adapt quickly while maintaining team cohesion impressed the observing instructors. As the scenario progressed, Sarah's team encountered several more complications that tested their ability to work together under pressure. Each time, Sarah demonstrated the kind of flexible leadership that she had observed Mitchell value during their private conversation. Instead of trying to control every detail, she provided clear guidance while allowing her team members to use their individual strengths. The most critical moment came when Sarah's team located the hostages but discovered that the extraction route they had planned was compromised. With simulated enemy forces closing in, Sarah had to make a split-second decision about how to proceed. Instead of panicking or forcing a predetermined solution, she quickly identified an alternative extraction method that utilized the building's structure in a way none of the previous teams had considered. Sarah's plan worked. Her team successfully extracted both hostages without taking casualties, and they reached the extraction point within the allocated time window. More importantly, from Mitchell's perspective, they had demonstrated the kind of adaptive teamwork that was essential for real-world special operations. During the post-exercise debrief, Mitchell's feedback was unlike anything Sarah had received during her previous weeks of training. Instead of focusing on her physical limitations or technical weaknesses, he highlighted her leadership approach and her team's effectiveness under pressure. He specifically mentioned her ability to incorporate team input into her planning and her Flexibility when circumstances changed. As the day concluded and all recruits had completed their scenarios, Mitchell gathered the entire class for a final evaluation session. He explained that the leadership exercise had been designed to identify qualities that were not always apparent in standard combat drills. Some recruits who had excelled in individual performance had struggled with the complexities of team leadership, while others had demonstrated capabilities that their previous performance had not revealed. Mitchell then did something unprecedented in the program's history. He called Sarah to the front of the room and addressed her directly in front of the entire class. His words were simple, but they changed everything. Never quit. Those two words carried weight that went far beyond their simple meaning. They represented Mitchell's recognition that Sarah possessed something valuable that could not be measured in physical fitness tests or combat drills. They acknowledged her persistence, her growth, and her potential to contribute to special operations in ways that were not captured by traditional metrics. The room was silent as Mitchell's words sank in. For weeks, Sarah had been seen as the recruit who was barely hanging on, the one who was most likely to be eliminated from the program. Now, in front of everyone who had witnessed her struggles, she was receiving recognition from one of the most respected officers in the special operations community. Mitchell explained to the class that special operations required many different types of warriors, and that some of the most valuable team members were those who had learned to overcome significant obstacles through determination and creative thinking. He used Sarah as an example of how persistence and adaptability could be just as important as raw physical capability. As the class was dismissed, Sarah remained standing at the front of the room, still processing what had just happened. Jessica was the first to approach her, with tears in her eyes and a huge smile on her face. Other recruits followed, offering congratulations and expressing respect for her persistence throughout the challenging weeks of training. That evening, as Sarah sat on her bunk writing a letter to her parents, she reflected on the incredible journey that had brought her to this moment. She had failed more combat drills than she could count, had been embarrassed in front of her peers countless times, and had come close to quitting on multiple occasions, but she had also learned something about herself that she never could have discovered in any other way. She had found reserves of mental strength she had not known existed, had developed leadership skills under the most demanding circumstances imaginable, and had earned the respect of people whose opinion mattered more than she had ever imagined possible.